September 15th, 1981 started out like any other autumn day in the quiet town of Esching, Germany. Like all the children in the area, it was Ursula Hermann's first day of primary school, and the year ahead was filled with the promise of fun and friends for the 10-year-old child. With light hair and bangs wisping over her light eyes, Ursula's older brother, Michael, recalls her liveliness as a child. He also fondly points out how Ursula's passion for life was also paired with an innate caution and sense of maturity. He wistfully remembers how Ursula was slightly more sensitive and mature than the other children in her elementary grades, and that she would sometimes get frustrated when her classmates would misbehave or act out in a repetitive manner that was not conducive to the school's learning environment. The 10-year-old loved playing piano and riding her bike, and regularly practiced tumbling and gymnastics in town. And Ursula would get to do all of these beloved activities after attending her first day of school. But shortly after such childhood privileges were innocently enjoyed, Ursula would be kidnapped and held captive in what would be the most heartbreakingly heinous case in the area's history. On September 15th, 1981, 10-year-old Ursula Hermann attended her first day of secondary school and returned to her house. She had 2 older brothers and an older sister. Her father was a teacher and her mother was a housewife. In the afternoon, Ursula practiced piano with her brother Michael, as they often did together. At 5 p.m., she rode her bicycle to the nearby village of Schöndorf, where she attended her regularly scheduled gymnastics class alongside her cousin. The village of Schöndorf is about 3 kilometers, just under 2 miles, away from the village of Esching, with a spruce forest running between the 2 towns. The forest is popular among hunters, joggers, and mountain bikers, and is known locally as Weingarten. After finishing their gymnastics class, Ursula decided to go back to her cousin's home in Schöndorf, which was a mere 10-minute bicycle ride from her own home in Esching. The 2 girls played and ate dinner together. At around 7:15 p.m., Ursula's mother called her sister, Ursula's aunt, to tell Ursula to come back home as it was already getting dark. Ursula left her cousin's home at around 7:20 p.m., cycling through the spruce forest. However, she never arrived back home. Half an hour later, when she still had not returned, her mother called Ursula's aunt again, this time inquiring as to her daughter's estimated time of arrival. Her aunt, now worried, told her that Ursula had left 25 minutes prior and that she should have reached home by now. The family immediately knew something was wrong and acted of their own accord to find the 10-year-old girl, along with calling police. Ursula's father and her uncle quickly went into the nearby spruce forest to look for her. Ursula's father walked from Esching to Schorndorf, while her uncle walked from Schorndorf to Esching. They both called out Ursula's name repeatedly throughout their converging paths, but she could not be found. Within an hour, the spruce-filled forest was crawling with police, neighbors, firefighters, and scent-detecting dogs, all searching for Ursula. Ursula would have taken the path that was right next to the Ammersee Lake in order to get home. She was well familiar with the path and had ridden her bike through the forest many times. The journey should have only taken her 10 minutes, as it had in the past. The search parties combed all around the path, but a rain had already begun falling steadily, and with the weather and pitch-black darkness, it was becoming very difficult for the searchers to look in the thick undergrowth. At around 11:15 p.m., a scent-detecting dog led police from the lake into the brush. About 20 meters away from the path, police located Ursula's red bicycle laying on the ground. However, Ursula was nowhere to be found. The police searched throughout the night, and at the break of dawn, the search was intensified. Dozens of police officers joined in and scoured the dense forest, while a helicopter searched from above. As police boats and divers were called in to search the lake, rescuers became more and more alarmed. There was no trace of the 10-year-old. On September 17, 1981, 36 hours from the time that the 10-year-old went missing, Ursula's family received a morbidly mysterious phone call. Ursula's father picked up the phone and said hello, but no one answered. The caller on the other end was completely silent. Then, a few seconds later, a popular radio jingle played for 3 seconds. Then, another moment of silence, after which the radio jingle played again before the caller hung up the phone. The jingle was recognized by the parents as the jingle that was used for the traffic bulletin on the Bion 3 radio station. Over the next few hours, 3 more similar cryptic calls were made to Ursula's home. The police then started recording these calls, but no one knew what they meant. The day after the cryptic and unclear calls of unknown origin were made, Ursula's home received an envelope marked urgent. Inside the envelope was a ransom note written with words cut out from the newspaper. The note was written in broken German and translated said, "We have kidnapped your daughter. If you ever want to see your daughter alive again, then pay 2 million Deutschmarks ransom." The note also said that if the Hermanns agreed to the ransom demand, then they should confirm it on the phone after the jingle played. In an unforeseen error, which could only be attributed to post office delays, the kidnappers had expected the note to be delivered 1 day earlier. The note ended with, "If you call the police or do not pay, we will kill your daughter." That afternoon, the kidnappers called again, and this time Ursula's mother, now possessing the necessary context with which to understand the directions, quickly agreed to pay the ransom after the jingle played. Her mother then asked the caller for proof that Ursula was alive, and asked, quote, "What are Ursula's 2 soft toys called?" But the caller remained silent. Ursula's mother then yelled, quote, "Talk to me, say something from Ursula." But the caller hung up the phone. The Hermanns were not very well off, and raising the ransom money was difficult. Thankfully, a neighbor raised some of the money, and the local government agreed to pay the rest. On the 21st of September, the Hermanns received another note, this time containing instructions for the transfer of the ransom money. The note asked the family to pay in used 100 Deutschmark bills packed into a suitcase. Ursula's father was to deliver the ransom money alone and drive a yellow Fiat 600 no faster than 90 kilometers an hour, which was about 56 miles per hour. This was odd considering the Fiat 600 was rarely found in Germany at the time. The note said to wait for further instructions on the date and the location of the dropping of the ransom. The family waited patiently for further instructions, but they would never receive any letters or phone calls ever again. 2 weeks later, after not having heard anything from the 2 kidnappers, the police decided to search the forest again. More than 100 police officers scoured the forest with 10 scent-sniffing dogs. The forest was divided into grids, and the police searched every grid one by one using metal rods to search the forest floor. 19 days after Ursula went missing, on October 4, 1981, at 9:30 a.m., an officer stumbled upon a clearing. When he poked the ground with his metal rod, he struck something beneath the forest floor. He shouted and notified other officers in the vicinity. The officers carefully began to dig in the ground. Soon, they discovered a brown blanket. After removing the blanket, they found a wooden board which appeared to be a lid to a box. They removed the wooden board to find another board beneath it. This board was painted green and was 72 centimeters in length and 60 centimeters in width. The police tried to remove it, but it was bolted down with 7 sliding bolts. The officers pried it open and looked inside. To the dismay of all parties involved, inside the box lay Ursula's cold and lifeless body. The officers themselves cried as they carried her body out of the box to be examined by the mortician. 2 police officers delivered the Hermanns the tragic news. The grieving parents asked if Ursula had been physically tortured beyond her confinement prior to her death. The officers at the time could not answer that, but an autopsy later confirmed that Ursula had not been hurt before her death. It stated that Ursula had likely died within 30 minutes to 5 hours after initially being buried. It is believed that she had been drugged, possibly with nitrous oxide, and then put in the box, as there was no sign of a struggle or any kind of movement in the box. The coroner determined that Ursula likely suffocated to death due to lack of oxygen in the crudely created and improperly vented burial box. Looking inside the box, the police determined that the kidnappers had intended on keeping their hostage alive. The box was 139 centimeters high and was buried in an upright position, like a phone booth. It had a seat with a hole in it which doubled as a toilet seat, and a bucket with water was placed underneath. Opposite the seat was a shelf which served as a desk. Sitting on top the shelf was a small portable radio, tuned to Byron 3, the same station which broadcast the jingle that played on the ransom phone call. The box contained 3 bottles of water, 12 cans of Fanta, 6 large chocolate bars, 4 packets of biscuits, an apple juice, 2 packs of chewing gum, and a portable light. The kidnappers had also left 21 books, including comics of Donald Duck, romance novels, thrillers, and westerns. The box was fitted with elaborate ventilation tubes made from plastic plumbing pipes which extended to ground level. However, the person who designed the box did not realize that an air pump would have been needed to circulate the air. Without the pump, oxygen would be exhausted in the box, as without forced movement, the air in the box would simply be composed of carbon dioxide, the waste product of breathing out, which would result in a low percentage of oxygen, causing death via asphyxiation. When Ursula's body was found by investigators, she was sitting on the makeshift seat with her head tilted backwards and her eyes closed. A jogging suit in a plastic bag was placed on her lap. It is believed that more than one kidnapper was involved, as the box weighed around 60 kilograms and would have been impossible for one individual to carry alone in the forest. The investigators supposed that the kidnappers must have known the area well, as they had chosen an area which was deep in the forest and very remote. The kidnappers had also tried to camouflage the area by placing 5 small spruce trees around as a makeshift barrier. The police were only able to find 1 single fingerprint on a piece of tape in the box. The police searched the area for any clues or footprints, but as the crime scene was not closed off initially, press reporters and members of the public had trampled the area, losing any valuable footprints or evidence that could have been recovered. During their search of the area, police found a bell wire strung through the trees placed next to the lakeside path. Thinking that it probably belonged to the children who played in the forest, the police left it as is. Later, it was thought that possibly the bell wire was placed there to alert the kidnapper or kidnappers that a potential victim was in the vicinity. Understandably, the people living in Esching and nearby villages were shaken after hearing the news. Parents were afraid to leave their kids alone. The case was highly covered in the media to the point that numerous reporters showed up at Ursula's funeral. The reporters even harassed the distraught family. Ursula's brother, Michael, knocked a camera on the ground after a cameraman held it in his face at his own sister's funeral. The police interviewed family and friends and issued a reward of 30,000 Deutschmarks for anyone who could provide any information that could lead to the arrest of the kidnapper or kidnappers. Soon, police received hundreds of tips from the general public. Many of those leads pointed to one individual in particular, Mr. Werner Marzurek. Marzurek was 31 years old and a trained car mechanic. He lived just a few hundred meters from Ursula's home and was married with 2 children. He was tall, strongly built, and known to be short-tempered. It was also found that he had a mounting debt of over 140,000 Deutschmarks. A week after Ursula's body was found, Merc was questioned by police, and initially he was not able to provide an alibi. But a day later, he would tell investigators that he was playing a board game with his wife and 2 friends at the time of Ursula's disappearance. Police searched his home, but were unable to find anything. A month later, they compared his fingerprints to the fingerprint found on the piece of tape at the crime scene. However, the prints did not match. Police still were not convinced of his innocence, though, and in January of 1982, he was again arrested, along with 2 of his friends. He was interrogated for several days, but was eventually released without any charges. A month later, Klaus Pfaffinger, an acquaintance of Mazurek, was interrogated. Klaus was an unemployed mechanic. He was brought in for questioning after his landlord told police that he had seen him driving on his moped with a spade tied to the side a few weeks before Ursula's disappearance. Klaus initially claimed he was innocent, but on the second day of questioning, Klaus confessed that he had dug a hole for Mazurek in September of 1981. He had dug this hole in the forest after Mazurek had promised to pay him 1,000 Deutschmarks and to give him color television. He also claimed to have seen the box being buried in that hole. The police then asked Klaus to lead them to the burial site in the forest, but he wasn't able to locate the site. He did not even know the directions to it. He would later retract his confession and was subsequently released without any charges. In 1982, 2 students from a nearby boarding school came forward with the bell wire that the police had found 1 year prior. The students told investigators that 8 months after Ursula's disappearance, they'd come across the wire while chasing an owl through the forest. They took it down and kept it with them in their dormitory in a locked box. The police theorized that the wire was used as an alarm system during Ursula's disappearance. They theorized that one kidnapper was on the lookout, and after seeing a potential victim, he would alert the other through a light-up bulb or perhaps a buzzer at the other end of the wire. Later, the forensics team would also find the impression of a mathematical probability tree on the paper of one of the ransom notes, suggesting that the kidnappers may have been students or younger people. One additional factor supporting this idea was the fact that the main character of one of the comic books that was left in the box drove a Fiat 600, the car that the kidnappers told Ursula's father to drive in the directions which were left in the ransom note, which suggested that the kidnapper may have read the comic book. Over the years, investigators would follow up on several leads, but nothing came of them. The case would eventually grow cold. In 2004, police reopened the case. They studied each and every clue and went over each and every suspect, trying to find any new leads. With advancements in DNA technology abundant, they were able to build a DNA profile from a screw on the box. In 2007, a DNA database found a potential match. The DNA matched a suspect who had brutally beaten a rich woman, Charlotte Bullinger, to death in a Munich penthouse. The suspect was Charlotte's own nephew, a 33-year-old man. During the trial, the nephew of Charlotte was eliminated as a suspect in Ursula's kidnapping, as the suspect would have only been 7 to 8 years old in 1981. The nephew was, however, already sentenced to life in prison for the commission of his own aunt's murder, and it is a baffling mystery to this day how the DNA taken from the screw on the box matched the nephew's. Some wondered if there had been contamination of the sample itself, perhaps from the lab processing it. Others speculated that it may have been an error in genetic profiling data. Ursula's kidnapping was not considered a murder under German law, as the kidnappers had not intended to kill her intentionally. Because of this, her case was considered a kidnapping with accidental death, which had a statute of limitations of 30 years. This meant that the police had only 4 more years before the perpetrators could no longer be held accountable. The prosecutors then decided to take another look at the original suspects in 1981, Klaus Pfeffinger and Werner Mazurek. Klaus was already dead, but Mazurek was still alive. Following 2007, the police started monitoring Mazurek. They tapped his phone and even deployed an undercover agent to befriend him. Later that year, his house was searched and a DNA sample was taken from him. However, the DNA sample did not match the DNA found at the crime scene. Among the items police recovered from Mazurek's home was an old tape recorder. Police claimed that it was the tape recorder used to play the jingle during the ransom phone calls in 1981. A sound expert was consulted and was given the original recordings of the jingle from 1981. The expert spent the next few months analyzing the recordings and conducting tests on the tape recorder. He claimed that the tape recorder had a technical defect which led the sound to be distorted. He said this was similar to the recording of the jingle from 1981. Therefore, he concluded that the tape recorder was most likely the recorder used by the kidnapper to play the jingle. On May 28, 2008, police arrested Mazurek and charged him with Ursula's kidnapping. Mazurek's trial took place in 2009. Ursula's parents did not attend the trial as they did not want to go through the pain of facing the terrible details of their daughter's death. Ursula's older brother, Michael, attended the trial. Mazurek pleaded not guilty. The bulk of the evidence against Mazurek was circumstantial. The prosecutors argued that Mazurek had the motivation, as he needed money and was a repairman who could have easily built the box. They also pointed out that he had a criminal record for fraud and forgery. The prosecutors also presented the story about a dog that Mazurek had killed in 1974. Reportedly, in 1974, the dog had littered rubbish from the dustbin onto the kitchen floor. Mazurek then grabbed the dog and locked it in the basement freezer. His wife had claimed that when she went to get some meat from the freezer, she saw the dog, who had perished to death. Mazurek later said that he had punished the dog with, quote, exile in Siberia. However, the most important evidence the prosecutors produced that helped them convict Mazurek hinged on 2 somewhat controversial pieces of evidence. First was the sound expert's statement about the tape recorder. When asked, Mazurek said that he had bought the tape recorder only a few weeks prior to his home being searched. He claimed he purchased it at a flea market. However, he was not able to prove who sold it to him, and no one at the market could recall if the tape recorder was actually sold there. The second piece of controversial evidence was Klaus's confession. The prosecutors believed that it was credible and that Klaus deliberately failed to locate the burial site so as to mislead the investigators so that they would release him. They pointed out that Klaus had accurately given details of the crime scene from the size of the box to the description of the burial site. In 2010, all of the prosecutor's arguments convinced the jury, and Mazurek was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. His wife was also on trial for being an accomplice, but was acquitted due to lack of evidence. Well, everyone was glad that the case was finally solved and that the perpetrator was behind bars. Ursula's brother was not convinced of Mazurek's guilt. Prior to the trial, Michael had been given access to the case files, and he read through all 6,000 pages over the next few weeks. Michael could not understand why Klaus's confession was treated as credible. Klaus was a known alcoholic and had claimed to have experienced hallucinations while in custody. Moreover, he pointed out that Klaus could have easily learned about the details of the crime scene from the media, as the case was highly covered. Klaus had also been interviewed several times by police after his confession, and he had changed his story several times. According to Klaus's ex-wife, Klaus was extremely lazy, and she doesn't think that he would have agreed to dig a hole in the forest. His DNA also did not match the DNA found at the crime scene. Most importantly, Klaus's confession was not signed. and investigators had written it down from memory a few weeks after the interview. Michael was also not satisfied with the sound expert's statement on the tape recorder. Michael had some expertise in sound as he was a music teacher, and he could not understand how the tape recorder could conclusively be linked to the phone calls. Since the court was not willing to re-examine the case, Michael came up with a plan. In 2013, Michael filed a civil claim against Merc for 20,000 euros, under the basis that Merc had caused him tinnitus as a result of psychological trauma from the case and the subsequent trial. Michael had hoped that this would force the court to re-examine the case, as Merc would claim he was wrongfully convicted and was not liable for the damages. But in August of 2018, the court ordered Merc to pay 7,000 euros for causing Michael's tinnitus, and stuck to the verdict that Merc was guilty. The trial has taken a toll on Michael. His health deteriorated, his career has also taken a hit, and he is separated from his wife. But he cannot give up his pursuit of finding out the truth. Michael is still working on getting a retrial. In a letter to the court, he had said, quote, "I'm not convinced of his guilt, but neither am I convinced of his innocence." The case is officially closed, but it is still not confirmed who truly kidnapped Ursula on that fateful day in 1981.